Welcome to this exploration of one of America's most unsettling historical cases. Today we travel deep into the shadowed hills of Kentucky, where in 1832, a bloodline carried secrets beyond human understanding. Tell us where you're watching from, because this story will leave a mark on every one of you. Hidden within the Appalachian Mountains, where endless forests consume the daylight and valleys swallow the sun, there once stood a remote community cut off from civilization. This was an age when much of Kentucky was still untamed wilderness, where the reach of the law faded into the distance. Families who settled there did so by choice, seeking seclusion, independence, and complete freedom from outside rule. The Kentucky Appalachian region was infamous for its perilous paths, deep ravines, and countless caverns stretching far underground. The climate was merciless. Winters so harsh they trapped entire settlements for months, and summers so humid the forests became green mazes where even seasoned guides could lose their way. It was in this forbidding land that the family at the center of our story forged their dark legacy. Records from Harlan County in that period are incomplete, yet they still uncover something deeply disturbing. About 15 miles from the nearest town lay a mountain estate, home to a family that had lived there for at least 3 generations. No one knew exactly when they arrived, but the elders whispered tales about them that would make any traveler think twice before taking those trails. The patriarch in 1832 was a man named Ezekiel, a towering figure with a gaze that seemed to pierce through anyone who met it. He lived with his brothers, their wives, and an unclear number of relatives on an estate that looked more like a natural fortress than a home. The main house was surrounded by smaller buildings, barns, and storage sheds, some with mysterious purposes outsiders couldn't identify. The property itself sat between 2 steep mountains, reachable only through a narrow path winding through jagged rock formations. Their nearest neighbors, miles away, rarely interacted with them. When a family member occasionally descended into town to trade, their dealings were brief and unsettling. They brought pelts, mountain herbs, and finely crafted metal tools, proof of impressive skill. In exchange, they took salt, gunpowder, cloth, and tools. They never lingered long enough to build trust or friendship with anyone. Over roughly 15 years, the county began noticing something alarming: a series of disappearances. Travelers passing through the Appalachian trails in that region simply never arrived at their destinations. At first, these losses were blamed on the dangers of the wilderness, steep falls, wild animals, or getting lost in the dense forests. Such misfortunes were not uncommon. But in 1828, 4 years before the darkest chapter of this tale, something shifted. A cloth merchant traveling alone from Virginia to Tennessee vanished near the area of Ezekiel's estate. Weeks later, his wagon was discovered 5 miles off the main path, partially burned, his goods missing. What disturbed investigators most was the violent state of the wagon, clear evidence of a struggle and signs that it had been set ablaze to erase the truth. At that time, Harlan County Sheriff Samuel Browning took charge. Known for his persistence and methodical mind, Browning reopened old missing person reports. What he uncovered was chilling. At least 17 people had disappeared within that same mountain range over the past 15 years. Most were lone travelers or small parties of 2 or 3. None were ever found, no bodies, no belongings, no trace. It was as though the mountains had swallowed them whole. Determined, Browning quietly began interviewing the oldest locals, those who knew every hidden path, cave, and family living deep in isolation. That's when one name began to surface again and again: Ezekiel's family. Always spoken in hushed tones, always with uneasy glances. No one dared to accuse them directly, but the implication was clear. Something sinister lingered on that land. The sheriff's collected accounts grew darker. Hunters claimed to hear screams echoing from that direction, cries too human to be mistaken for animals. Others spoke of strange smoke rising at odd hours, carrying an unnatural stench. Some swore they'd seen members of the family silently watching travelers from afar, vanishing the moment anyone tried to approach. One particularly haunting story came from a lumberjack who, while tracking a wounded deer, wandered too close to the property. 2 armed men emerged from the trees without a word, staring him down until he retreated. What stayed with him for the rest of his life was their gaze. Cold, calculating, utterly devoid of emotion. Browning knew rumors alone wouldn't be enough. The law required solid proof, and trespassing without cause could bring severe consequences. So he took another route. He began mapping the disappearances, dates, places, patterns, comparing them with neighboring counties' records. For months, he gathered evidence, slowly revealing a terrifying pattern. The vanishings were not confined to Harlan County. Similar cases appeared in Bell, Knox, and Leslie counties, all bordering the same mountainous region. When Browning looked further back, he found reports stretching over 20 years, long before his time as sheriff. The most disturbing realization came when he studied the victims themselves. Nearly all were people traveling alone or in small numbers, with no family expecting them at their destination. Peddlers, gold seekers, wanderers. Individuals who could disappear without immediate notice. It seemed someone was deliberately selecting victims who would not be missed. By 1831, a year before the most horrifying revelation of that decade, Sheriff Browning knew he couldn't handle this alone. He rode 5 days on horseback to Frankfort, the capital of Kentucky, to lay out his findings before state officials, crossing rugged peaks, shadowed valleys, and settlements barely marked on any official maps. During that long ride, Browning had ample time to consider the full scope of what he was probing. Officials in Frankfort received his report with a degree of doubt at first. Disappearances in the Appalachians were not rare. The woodlands were thick, game plentiful, and weather unpredictable. Bears, wolves, and panthers still roamed. Fatal tumbles into ravines were common. Many travelers simply wandered off and perished from exposure or hunger before anyone could locate them. Yet Browning's case was compelling. He presented carefully drafted charts that highlighted clusters of vanishings. He pointed out seasonal trends, how incidents rose in the warmer months when travel increased. He offered witness statements which, while inconclusive on their own, collectively sketched a disturbing pattern. Something in those hills went beyond the ordinary hazards of the country. The state's attorney, Theodore Harrison, was especially struck by one thread in Browning's work. Several missing men had been known to be carrying sizable sums or valuable cargo. One was a gold dealer last seen with roughly 1,200 in nuggets and dust, another a spice merchant from the south with goods appraised at about 800. Those sums were meaningful in the 1830s. Harrison authorized Browning to assemble a small investigative unit. But on one strict condition, they had to produce concrete proof before taking formal action against the family. Property rights were strongly protected, and trespass without justification could ruin Browning's career and embarrass the state. The situation demanded caution and strategy. Browning returned to Harlan County in late 1831 with two aides, James Mallister, an experienced surveyor from Louisville, and Robert Chen, the son of Chinese immigrants who'd served as an army tracker. Chen's tracking skills proved invaluable. He read forest signs that most white men overlooked. The trio set up a discreet base in a boarding house in Cumberland, roughly 20 miles from the mountain estate. During the winter, when snow made access nearly impossible, they combed every available record, interviewed scores of witnesses, and planned their approach down to the smallest detail. Browning knew they would likely have only a single opportunity to act. As interviews accumulated, an even more unsettling pattern surfaced. Several locals recalled family members sporadically coming into towns to sell personal items, pocket watches, rings, medals, and tools of exceptional make. When pressed about origins, sellers offered vague tales of inheritances or trades with other mountain folk. Browning began logging detailed descriptions and cross-referencing them with the possessions of missing persons. One story chilled him. A Harlan watchmaker remembered purchasing a silver pocket watch marked with the initials JTM. He kept it because the engraving made the piece hard to resell. In the missing persons ledger was an 1826 entry for Jonathan Thomas Morrison, a hardware merchant who had vanished. His wife in Virginia had described a silver watch he always carried, a wedding gift bearing her initials. The watchmaker said he'd bought the piece from one of Ezekiel's brothers about 2 years after Morrison disappeared. The buyer had paid in gold coins. Odd behavior for someone supposedly living by subsistence in the mountains. When Browning asked whether the seller seemed uneasy, the watchmaker replied that the man had shown no sign of emotion, as if the object had no history at all. Browning widened his inquiries and found more troubling links: a saddle sold in Bell County matching a missing traveler's description from 1829, a German hunting rifle located in a Knox County pawn shop, tied to a hunter who disappeared in 1827, and several other personal effects with histories the sellers could not credibly explain. Meanwhile, Chen began covert surveillance around the estate, staying well back but watching movement patterns. He noted that family members regularly patrolled roughly a 2-mile perimeter, knew every trail and shortcut, and made it nearly impossible to approach unnoticed. He also observed side paths leading deep into unproductive woods with no obvious farming or hunting purpose. On February nights with full moons, Chen risked a closer observation from a high ridge with partial sightlines to the property. He watched lights moving between buildings and heard activity at odd hours. People shifting heavy loads between structures, moving silently with deliberate coordination. These were not ordinary farm chores. Something more organized and secretive was happening. Mallister, focusing on the financial angle, traced sporadic deposits of gold by family members into banks across different cities. Never twice in the same place. The sums individually weren't dramatic, but accumulated over years they revealed wealth inconsistent with subsistence living. Where did this gold originate? How could a family living off hunting and basic farming amass such funds? By March 1832, as the snow melted and trails reopened, Browning made a daring choice. He enlisted Daniel Foster, a traveling merchant, to act as bait. Foster agreed to traverse the route near the estate while carrying apparently valuable, but actually worthless, wares. Browning, Mallister, and Chen would shadow him at a distance, prepared to intervene if anything occurred. The scheme skirted legal boundaries, but Browning believed it was the only way to secure definitive evidence. If the family preyed upon travelers, Foster would be an obvious mark. If nothing transpired, their hypothesis would at least have been tested. But if something did happen, they would be present to document it and step in. It was a perilous ruse that could cost lives, including their own. Foster departed on a fog-laden morning in late March, steering a modest horse-drawn wagon loaded with crates that only looked like trade goods. They were filled with rocks and wood to mimic the weight of valuable merchandise. Browning and his 2 men followed about a kilometer behind, staying parallel to the trail and hidden within the thick forest. Chen led the way, relying on his expert tracking skills to keep them undetected. As Foster neared the stretch of road closest to the family's property, the atmosphere changed abruptly. Chen sensed it first. An eerie stillness had fallen over the forest. No birds sang, no rustle of movement came from the undergrowth. It was as though every living thing had fled. He signaled Browning and Mallister to slow down and proceed with heightened caution. Something was coming. Foster pressed on, outwardly calm but inwardly alert. He'd been instructed to watch for any unusual movement and to shout a coded phrase if he sensed immediate danger. His task was to stay composed, engage anyone who approached, and buy enough time for Browning's team to get into position. The trail curved through a thick stand of pine and oak where sunlight barely broke through the canopy. The air was cool and damp, typical of spring mornings in high country. His hands tightened around the reins, though he kept his expression neutral. Then, without warning, they appeared. 3 men stepped out from the trees as if materializing from the mist itself. They made no sound, just stood there blocking the path. Each carried a rifle, held low but ready. From his concealed post 100 meters away, Chun recognized 2 of them from his previous surveillance. The man in the center was tall, in his 40s, dark-haired with gray at the temples, and his pale eyes fixed on Foster with a piercing coldness. It was Ezekiel, the patriarch. The 2 others, likely brothers or sons, bore similar features and the same lifeless stare. Foster drew the wagon to a halt. His pulse raced, but his voice remained steady. He greeted the men politely, saying he was a merchant traveling from Virginia to Tennessee, selling cloth and tools along the way. He asked if they wished to see his goods, his tone easy and practiced. Exactly as Browning had trained him to sound, Ezekiel didn't respond at once. He simply studied Foster, his wagon, his horse, the boxes in the back, as if weighing every detail, even the man himself, like a farmer inspecting livestock. After a long silence, he finally spoke. His voice was rough and low, with a mountain drawl so thick that Foster had to strain to understand. Ezekiel asked where he came from, where he was bound, and whether anyone expected him. The words seemed casual, but their intent was unmistakable. He was gauging whether Foster would be missed if he vanished. Following instructions, Foster lied smoothly. He claimed to have family in Knoxville waiting for him, and that he was due there by week's end to meet merchants who knew his route. Ezekiel's expression barely shifted, but a brief flicker passed through his eyes. Disappointment, perhaps calculation. Foster couldn't tell. The men exchanged subtle glances, communicating silently. Then Ezekiel stepped aside just enough to open the path. He told Foster he was on private land and should continue straight ahead, and never return that way again. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat. Foster thanked him, flicked the reins, and urged the horse forward. He kept his gaze fixed on the road, every nerve taut, feeling the weight of their stares burning into his back. Only after the trail curved and he was out of sight did he exhale, releasing the tension that had gripped him. From their concealed vantage points, Browning and his men had witnessed everything. Mallister's face had gone pale. He gripped his rifle until his knuckles whitened. He whispered that the men had almost certainly planned to ambush Foster, and only his claim of having family waiting had deterred them. Chen concurred, adding that he'd seen the trio exchange coded hand gestures, a silent system clearly designed for coordination without words. What followed was even more disturbing. Chen chose to remain behind to observe the family's next move. From a high perch overlooking the side trails he'd mapped earlier, he watched as Ezekiel and the others split up instead of returning home. Each took a different path, methodically checking certain areas, as if inspecting hidden positions. Chen shadowed Ezekiel from a safe distance, blending into the forest. The man traveled nearly 2 miles through tangled brush until reaching a thicket where fallen trees and dense undergrowth formed natural barriers. There, Ezekiel stopped before what looked like an ordinary pile of rocks and logs. But then he brushed aside branches, revealing a concealed opening in the ground, an entrance to a camouflaged cave or underground chamber. Without hesitation, he descended into the darkness and vanished from sight. Chen waited motionless for almost an hour. When Ezekiel finally reemerged, he was carrying a duffel bag that hadn't been with him before. He carefully replaced the branches and debris, ensuring the entrance was hidden once more, scanned the forest for any disturbance, and started back toward the main homestead. Chen memorized the precise location of that secret opening. He knew he had found something vital, but he also knew he couldn't act alone. Any interference would alert the family that they were being watched. Had purchased that wagon weeks earlier from a passing trader who had no further use for it. His explanation was smooth, almost rehearsed, but Browning could sense the tension beneath the surface. He asked for the trader's name, yet Ezekiel hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying that he couldn't recall. That hesitation told Browning everything he needed to know. Mallister subtly shifted his stance, one hand resting near his holster, his eyes scanning the nearby structures. Every door and window seemed to conceal a watcher. The silence pressed down heavier than before. Even the wind had stilled. Browning decided to press his advantage. He asked if they could take a closer look at the wagon, explaining that any small detail could help identify whether it belonged to the missing merchant. Ezekiel's pale blue eyes locked onto his. For a long, drawn-out moment, he said nothing. Then, with the same low, gravelly voice, he stated that the wagon was now the family's property, and that no one was permitted to inspect their belongings without a proper warrant. The words were polite, but the threat behind them was unmistakable. The men behind him tightened their grips on their rifles. Mallister whispered that they should leave, but Browning stayed calm, determined not to show fear. He nodded slowly, saying he respected the law and would indeed obtain the warrant if necessary. Ezekiel's expression didn't shift, but his eyes tracked every small movement the officers made. Before turning his horse, Browning looked once more toward the wagon. He noticed faint stains on the wooden sideboards, dark, irregular patches that might have been dried mud or something far worse. They left the property under the watchful eyes of the 5 men, who remained utterly motionless until Browning and Mallister disappeared into the trees. Only then did the faint echo of footsteps follow them from the direction of the house. Once they were safely out of sight, Mallister exhaled sharply. His voice trembled slightly as he said they needed immediate backup. Browning agreed, but added that time was against them. If the family realized they were under suspicion, any remaining evidence would vanish, just like all the travelers before Webb. Meanwhile, Chen, hidden on the ridge above the property, continued his watch. Through his field glass, He saw Ezekiel and the others move quickly once the visitors were gone. They uncovered the wagon completely and began unloading it, transferring its contents into one of the side buildings. What Chen saw next froze his blood. One of the younger men carried a long, heavy object wrapped in canvas, its shape unmistakably human. Chen didn't move, didn't breathe. He knew if he revealed himself now, he would die before he could even shout a warning. He waited until they finished and disappeared inside the barn before slipping away through the forest to rejoin Browning. When they met again hours later, Chen relayed what he had witnessed. Browning's face turned pale. There was no longer any doubt. Marcus Webb had met the same fate as others before him. But proving it, and stopping this family before they struck again, would require a plan far more dangerous than any of them had ever imagined. Dim and suffocating, the windows covered with thick cloth that blocked out nearly all light. Dust motes floated in the narrow beams that managed to slip through the cracks. The air was heavy with decay, the smell unmistakably human. Browning motioned for Mallister to follow as they stepped inside. The floorboards creaked beneath their boots. The main room was cluttered with old furniture, stacks of wooden crates, and tools that looked more suited for butchering than for farming. Along one wall hung several animal hides, but as Browning's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized that not all of them were animal. A faint sob came from behind a closed door toward the back of the house. Browning moved swiftly, pushing it open with his shoulder. Inside was a small, windowless room lit by a single oil lamp. A woman sat tied to a chair, her wrists raw from the ropes, her mouth gagged with a dirty strip of cloth. Her eyes were wide with terror and relief as she saw the sheriff. Mallister hurried to untie her, while Browning kept his weapon raised toward the doorway. The woman trembled violently, too frightened to speak at first. When she finally managed a few words, her voice came out cracked and dry. She said her name was Clara Webb, Marcus Webb's wife. She had been traveling behind her husband by a day's distance when she was taken. She hadn't seen him since. Browning's chest tightened. That confirmed his worst fear. Marcus Webb was dead, and this woman had likely witnessed part of it. Before he could ask more, Mallister's eyes went to a dark stain spreading beneath the door opposite them. He slowly crossed the room and pushed it open. What lay beyond was worse than either man had imagined. The room was cold, its floor made of packed earth. Hanging from hooks fixed to the ceiling were several large, wrapped bundles. The smell of decomposition hit them full force. Browning tore one open and found what he already suspected: human remains. Multiple victims preserved and hidden, their clothing matching the descriptions of travelers who had gone missing over the years. Mallister staggered back, gagging. Browning clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain composed. They had uncovered evidence of murder, dozens of them, possibly spanning decades. This was no ordinary crime scene. It was a graveyard built in secret. From outside came Chen's shout. Browning ran to the front window and saw Ezekiel making a break for the woods, his rifle abandoned on the porch. Chen fired a warning shot into the air, ordering him to stop. Ezekiel didn't listen. He bolted into the trees, moving with inhuman speed for a man of his age. Browning turned to Mallister. "Get her out. Now," he ordered, gesturing to Clara. Mallister led her outside, shielding her as the other men stood frozen in shock. Still under Chen's aim, Browning chased Ezekiel into the forest, the branches clawing at his coat as he ran. The chase lasted nearly 10 minutes before Browning caught sight of the man near a rocky incline. The same direction Chen had once seen him vanish days earlier. Ezekiel reached the camouflaged entrance, ripping away branches to reveal the hidden opening in the ground. Before he could descend, Browning shouted for him to stop. Ezekiel turned, his pale blue eyes wild but eerily calm. "You don't understand, Sheriff," he said, his voice steady despite his ragged breathing. "This land demanded blood long before my family came here. We only obeyed." Then he stepped backward into the darkness. Browning lunged forward, but by the time he reached the hole, Ezekiel was gone. The echo of his fall faded into silence. Browning stared into the abyss for several seconds, his mind racing. Whatever lay beneath that ground wasn't just a hiding place. It was something older, deeper. Something that had consumed the entire family. By the time he returned to the property, the clouds had broken and rain began to fall. Chen and Mallister were securing the scene, Clara wrapped in a blanket sobbing quietly. Browning didn't speak. He simply looked back toward the forest, toward that hidden entrance, knowing that even though the case was over, the horror buried in those woods was far from done. Astonishingly orderly, as though whoever had done this believed they were preserving history rather than hiding atrocity. Every skull bore a small marking on the forehead, a number corresponding to entries in the notebooks found upstairs. It was systematic, deliberate, an archive of death maintained over generations. Browning stood frozen for a long moment, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The beam danced across rows of hollow sockets staring back at him. Mallister, pale and speechless, whispered that this was no cellar. It was a crypt built by human hands. Browning took one step forward, scanning the stone walls. Carved into the surface were initials, dates, and strange symbols, some religious, others completely alien to him. They seemed to record each killing like some twisted sacrament. The deeper he went, the more it became clear this wasn't madness alone. It was ritual. Near the center of the chamber was a wooden table stained dark by years of use. On it were tools, knives, bone saws, clamps, all cleaned and neatly aligned. It was a grotesque reflection of Ezekiel's obsessive order. Beside the table lay a small chest. Inside were more journals, these even older, the ink faded and the handwriting different. They belonged to Ezekiel's father and grandfather. The pattern stretched back to before the turn of the century. The realization hit Browning like a physical blow. This wasn't merely Ezekiel's doing. It was an inheritance, a family legacy of murder that had continued for nearly 3 generations. He stepped back, struggling to breathe in the heavy, stifling air. Mallister's voice echoed faintly through the chamber, saying they needed to seal the area immediately and call for reinforcements. Browning nodded wordlessly. As they climbed back to the surface, every creak of the wooden ladder sounded like the groan of the dead below. Outside, the scene was eerily calm. Chen was loading the prisoners into the wagon, their faces still devoid of emotion. None spoke or resisted. Ezekiel stood slightly apart, wrists bound, staring toward the dark line of the forest. When Browning approached with the notebooks and the horror of the underground chamber still burning in his mind, Ezekiel finally spoke. His tone was flat, almost conversational. "You shouldn't have opened it," he said. "What sleeps down there doesn't forgive disturbance." Browning ignored the words, reading them as the ramblings of a fanatic trying to justify decades of cruelty. But something in the man's eyes, something ancient and unyielding, sent a chill through him nonetheless. By the time the sun began to set, the property had filled with deputies from neighboring counties. The investigators documented every corner, every room, every inch of the underground tunnels. The evidence was overwhelming: physical remains, written records, stolen belongings. It would take months to process everything. As the prisoners were taken away, Ezekiel turned once more toward Browning. "You can bury the bones," he said quietly, "but the ground remembers." Browning said nothing. He simply watched as the wagons rolled away into the gathering dusk, the wind whispering through the trees like voices from beneath the earth. Deep inside, he knew that even though the arrests had ended the killings, something in those mountains would never truly rest. It revealed a mindset that regarded the victims not as people, but as collectibles. McAllister noticed something else that made the discovery even more disturbing. Next to each group of bones were small, yellowed tags, each bearing handwritten notes identical to the writing in the notebooks found earlier. Names, dates, and capture sites. It was a complete registry kept with a level of precision rivaling official government archives. The family hadn't merely committed these atrocities, they had documented them with the same diligence one might use for bookkeeping. Browning forced himself to count. There were remains of at least 30, 8 individuals in that underground vault, each set carefully sorted and labeled. When he compared the names on those tags to the list of missing persons he had compiled during his investigation, the matches were exact. Jonathan Thomas Morrison, the trader whose watch turned up in Harlem. Elizabeth Porter, the lone traveler who vanished in 1820. Samuel Chen, a miner who disappeared in 1818, possibly related to Browning's own partner. But many names didn't appear in any records at all. People no one had ever searched for, whose absence had gone unnoticed. Wanderers without family, drifters, outlaws perhaps. The family had deliberately chosen targets unlikely to be missed, a calculated strategy that allowed their crimes to go undetected for decades. As Browning documented the horrific chamber, the scope of the family's operation became clearer. This wasn't random brutality or opportunistic robbery. It was an organized system perfected over generations. Each member had a role: scouting, capturing, guarding, disposing, all carried out with chilling coordination. It functioned like a grotesque enterprise, disturbingly efficient in its cruelty. Meanwhile, outside, Chen kept a close eye on the detained men. Ezekiel remained expressionless and silent, but one of the younger captives began to unravel. His hands shook, his eyes flickered with panic, and he muttered incoherently under his breath. Sensing an opening, Chen gently questioned him, applying interrogation methods learned during his service with military authorities. Eventually, the young man, identified as Jacob, 22 years old, began to speak in broken phrases that soon formed a horrifying account. He revealed that he had been born and raised on the property, never knowing a world beyond those mountains. For as long as he could remember, his family had lived by this gruesome routine: capturing travelers, keeping them imprisoned until they were no longer useful, then disposing of their remains. Jacob described how the system worked. The men would patrol nearby trails, searching for isolated travelers carrying valuables. They assessed whether their potential victims had relatives or anyone who might come looking for them. Once chosen, the target would be lured to the farm with some ruse, an offer of assistance, supplies, or simply a confrontation blocking the path. Victims were confined in the basement, sometimes for days or weeks, interrogated for information about hidden money or valuables, and ultimately killed when deemed unnecessary. Their possessions were later sold discreetly in distant towns, ensuring no connection to the farm. The profits were divided among family members, an unnatural wealth for such a remote household. As for the bodies, Jacob said that at first they buried them deep in the woods, but Ezekiel's fixation grew darker with time. He began preserving the skeletons, meticulously cleaning and arranging them, claiming it was a form of remembrance, a deranged justification none dared challenge. Defying him meant severe punishment. When Chen relayed Jacob's statement to Browning, it gave the investigation grim clarity. This wasn't merely a family of murderers. It was an entire lineage warped by isolation and ruled by a tyrannical patriarch. The children had grown up believing this monstrous system was normal, a necessary means of survival in the unforgiving wilderness. Yet indoctrination did not absolve them. They had all played their parts in the suffering and deaths of dozens of innocent souls. Browning knew what awaited them: trials followed by certain execution under Kentucky's laws of the time. Multiple murders carried the penalty of hanging, and the evidence was beyond dispute. The search of the estate continued into the night. McAllister uncovered the hidden forest entrance Chen had seen Ezekiel visit earlier. Inside the natural cavern, converted into a secret storeroom, they found even more incriminating evidence: tools used in the killings, blood-stained clothing, documents, and stashes of stolen cash concealed within false walls. It was a grotesque archive chronicling decades of horror. In a small outbuilding, investigators discovered a workshop that exposed another layer of the operation. Here, stolen goods were altered before resale. Watch engravings filed off, rings melted and reforged, papers destroyed. It was a sophisticated laundering setup designed to erase every trace of the victims' identities. Browning ordered all evidence catalogued with meticulous care. The upcoming trial would be one of the most consequential in Kentucky's history, and every detail had to be preserved flawlessly. He dispatched Chen to the nearest town to summon reinforcements, additional officers, and a physician to tend to Marcus Webb, who remained alive but in fragile condition. As dusk settled over the grim homestead, Browning turned once more to Ezekiel, still unflinching, still silent, and prepared to make one final attempt to break his resolve. The patriarch had remained wordless throughout the day, silently observing as investigators exposed the dark history of his bloodline. But at last, perhaps realizing there was no longer any use in denying it, he began to speak. What came from his mouth was as unsettling as the horrors already uncovered. Ezekiel stated with eerie calm and no trace of remorse that his family had lived this way for 3 generations. His grandfather had started it all when he settled in the mountains during the late 1700s, discovering that preying upon travelers was far more profitable than honest work. His father continued and refined the practice, and Ezekiel himself had perfected it over time. He didn't view it as murder. To him, it was simply the family's trade, a custom passed from father to son. He described how he had taught the younger ones, training them to recognize vulnerable victims and punishing mistakes that might expose their secret. He spoke with the detachment of a craftsman explaining his trade. To Ezekiel, capturing and killing travelers was no different from tending crops or mending tools. It was a survival skill, a way for his bloodline to endure in the harsh isolation of the Appalachian wilderness. As night settled over the mountains, a piercing chill filled the air. Browning lit lanterns around the property while waiting for reinforcements, their flickering glow casting distorted shadows across the buildings. Remaining there after dark felt almost unbearable. Every whisper of wind seemed to carry echoes of the atrocities committed over generations. Mallister continued his search, unwilling to leave a single clue undiscovered. In a small storage shed, he stumbled upon documents that added another layer to the nightmare. Business ledgers, receipts, and transaction records spanning 15 years, linking the family to sales made in towns across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. They hadn't merely robbed their victims, they had maintained precise financial accounts of their blood-stained profits. The sums were staggering, roughly 15,000 accumulated over 20 years, a fortune for the time. Some of it was buried in jars or hidden in secret compartments, while other portions had been reinvested into the property itself, improving its infrastructure to support their gruesome enterprise. But what disturbed Mallister most were the repeated names of merchants and intermediaries listed in the books. Certain buyers had done business with the family again and again, purchasing valuables without ever questioning their origins. It became clear that the killers had not been completely isolated. There were outsiders who must have at least suspected the truth, yet turned a blind eye in exchange for profit. When Browning reviewed the evidence, fury and frustration mixed within him. The case he thought was drawing to a close might, in fact, only be beginning. If accomplices existed beyond these hills, they too had blood on their hands. Bringing them to justice would mean a far-reaching investigation across several states. A long, grueling process, but for now, his duty was to ensure that the main culprits faced swift prosecution. Roughly 4 hours later, Chen returned, bringing the deputy sheriff from the neighboring county, a local physician, and 3 armed men for security. The doctor immediately attended to Marcus Webb, confirming multiple fractures, dehydration, and severe trauma. Yet he would survive, though his recovery would be long and painful. Deputy Sheriff William Porter, a seasoned officer with 2 decades of experience, was visibly shaken as Browning guided him through the evidence. When he descended into the chamber where the skeletal remains were arranged, he barely lasted a minute before stumbling back outside, retching in the cold night air. After composing himself, he returned grimly to assist. The team drew up a detailed plan to preserve and transport every piece of evidence. At dawn, the 5 arrested men would be escorted under heavy guard to the Harlan County Jail. The notebooks and records would be transported separately under strict supervision, while the human remains would later be exhumed and, if possible, identified for return to their families. Throughout the night, Chen kept watch and continued speaking with Jacob, who seemed almost relieved to finally unburden himself. He described his upbringing, how cruelty and violence were normalized, woven into the rhythm of daily life. At 13, his father, one of Ezekiel's brothers, had taken him to witness his first capture, calling it his initiation. He still remembered the terror in the traveler's eyes, a middle-aged man pleading for mercy, and how his father coldly told him that mercy was weakness, that survival demanded ruthlessness. From that moment on, Jacob was drawn deeper into the family's crimes. He learned how to track victims, set traps, and guard prisoners, though unlike the others, he never grew numb to the suffering. Every scream haunted him, every act of violence left him tormented. He had dreamed many times of running away, but was paralyzed by fear of Ezekiel, and by ignorance of the world beyond those mountains. Listening to him, Chen felt torn. Jacob was both perpetrator and victim, shaped from birth by a monstrous lineage, yet fully complicit in its horrors. It would be up to the courts to decide where guilt ended and circumstance began. As the night deepened, Browning organized a strict watch rotation to ensure the prisoners remained secure and that no evidence was tampered with. He took the first shift himself, unable to rest even if he tried. His thoughts churned endlessly. about the countless lives lost, the years of unchecked evil, and how all this time, such atrocities had thrived right under his jurisdiction without his knowing. In his own county, the weight of failure pressed heavily on Browning's shoulders. He had initially logged 17 missing persons cases, but the truth proved far more horrifying. 43 confirmed victims over 25 years, with the possibility of more yet undiscovered. The question tormented him: how many of these souls might have been spared if he had investigated sooner, pushed harder, or taken the locals' eerie tales seriously? Still, he knew he was being too harsh on himself. The family had operated with chilling precision, choosing victims carefully, erasing traces of evidence, and keeping their activities hidden under a veil of secrecy, without the exact sequence of events that led to the deeper investigation. Foster's narrow survival on the trail, the discovery of Webb's wagon, they might have continued their killings indefinitely. The isolation of the Appalachian Mountains, poor communication between counties, and the limited capabilities of law enforcement at the time created a perfect storm for such horrors to thrive unnoticed. When dawn finally broke, casting pale light through the mist that blanketed the ridges, Browning felt a complicated mix of relief and dread. The gruesome discovery phase was done, but ahead lay the equally difficult battle for justice, the scrutiny of the public, and the emotional storm that would come with meeting the victims' families. It would be a long and harrowing ordeal for everyone involved. The prisoners were readied for transport. Ezekiel remained expressionless and silent as ever, while the others appeared wary and defeated. Jacob, in particular, looked broken. His cooperation with the authorities clearly weighed on him, torn between betraying his kin and freeing himself from that cursed life. It was a conflict that would haunt him for years to come. By mid-morning, the caravan departed the property. Browning led the convoy, followed by the prisoner's wagon heavily guarded by armed men, and another wagon behind carrying Marcus Webb and critical evidence. Mallister and Chen stayed behind with a team to continue documenting and securing the site for full forensic processing. The descent down the mountain trails lasted nearly the entire day. During the journey, Browning contemplated how he would present the case to state officials and the press. The crimes were so depraved that he would have to handle the information delicately, balancing transparency with restraint to avoid panic or sensationalism. The victims' families deserved the truth, but with compassion and care. By the time they reached Harlem and booked the prisoners, crowds had already gathered. Even without modern communication, word of the shocking events had spread rapidly through neighboring towns. Browning had to assign extra guards at the jail, fearing vigilante justice. In Kentucky during that era, mob lynchings were not unusual when crimes of such magnitude were exposed. Over the following days, Browning poured all his energy into building the formal case. Ezekiel's journals provided damning written evidence, supported by physical remains, stolen belongings, and the testimonies of Marcus Webb, and eventually Jacob, who agreed to testify against the others in exchange for leniency. 2 weeks after the arrests, State Attorney Theodore Harrison arrived in Harlem with a legal team and additional investigators. They set up a temporary office in the courthouse and began meticulously reviewing the evidence Browning had compiled. The enormity of the case became clear. This wasn't just another murder trial, but likely the most extensive and disturbing criminal case in Kentucky's history. Harrison chose to prosecute all 5 men at once but on separate charges, ensuring each one's individual guilt was firmly established. Ezekiel would face 43 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each confirmed victim. The others would be charged according to their level of involvement and duration of participation. Jacob, the youngest and most remorseful, would face fewer counts and the potential for a reduced sentence. While the legal proceedings took shape, Mallister and Chen remained at the mountain property, bringing in specialists from Frankfurt to assist with the exhumation and identification of the victims. It was grueling, heartbreaking work that took weeks. Each skeleton was carefully unearthed, photographed, catalogued, and prepared for eventual return to the families. Without modern forensic tools, the team relied on physical traits, personal belongings, and Ezekiel's meticulous notes to match the remains with missing persons reports. Despite the limitations, they successfully identified 27 of the 43 victims. Delivering the news to the families proved the most painful task of all. Browning personally visited several towns and states to inform loved ones that their long-missing relatives had finally been found. For some, the revelation brought bittersweet closure, relief mixed with sorrow. Others responded with anger, demanding to know why justice had taken so long, why so many had perished before anyone acted. One encounter stayed etched in Browning's heart. He traveled to Virginia to see Martha Morrison, widow of Jonathan Thomas Morrison, whose remains had been uncovered 6 years after his disappearance. Martha, now in her 50s, had endured years of torment, trapped between hope and despair. When Browning handed her Jonathan's silver pocket watch engraved with his initials, she clutched it to her chest and wept silently. She spoke of how Jonathan had been a kind and hard-working man, gone missing on his way home from a business trip in 1826. She had pleaded with authorities, hired private investigators, all to no avail. Eventually, she had been forced to accept the unbearable unknown. Now, holding proof of his fate, Martha expressed what so many others would echo, that even the most horrifying truth was better than endless uncertainty. Knowing her husband hadn't abandoned her, but had fallen victim to unspeakable evil, gave her a painful but vital peace. At last, she could mourn him properly, lay him to rest, and begin the long, slow process of living again. ChatGPT said meanwhile, news of the case spread rapidly beyond Kentucky's borders. Newspapers in major cities such as Louisville, Cincinnati, and even Nashville began printing stories about the horrific discovery in the Appalachian Mountains. Some reports were wildly exaggerated for sensational effect, while others attempted to convey the facts with grim respect. The family's property quickly became infamous, a symbol of the unspeakable evil that could thrive in isolated corners of the nation. The growing public fascination placed enormous pressure on Harrison and his team to conduct a flawless prosecution. Any procedural mistake or lapse in due process could open the door for appeals or, worse, acquittal. Harrison understood that the entire country was watching, that this case would set a precedent for how serial crimes were handled in the courts. He needed to ensure justice was done, without compromising the system's integrity. Jury selection began in August 1832, 4 months after the arrests. Harrison decided to start with Ezekiel's trial, recognizing that as the patriarch and mastermind behind the atrocities, his case was both the strongest and most crucial. Finding unbiased jurors was an ordeal. Nearly everyone in Harlan County and neighboring regions had heard about the case and formed opinions. Eventually, 12 men were chosen, most hailing from remote rural districts where the rumors had reached less intensely. Harrison instructed them firmly to base their judgment solely on courtroom evidence, not gossip or newspaper stories. The trial was overseen by Judge Silas Bradford, a seasoned magistrate known for his strict fairness. He vowed that both sides would have equal opportunity to present their cases and that the proceedings would be conducted with absolute discipline. Ezekiel's defense was taken up by 2 court-appointed attorneys from Frankfort, Daniel Hutchinson and Robert Myers, since all of Ezekiel's property and assets had been confiscated. They knew from the start that their position was nearly hopeless. The evidence was overwhelming: Ezekiel's detailed journals, the physical proof uncovered on the property, and credible witnesses who could corroborate the events. Hutchinson chose a strategy of limited admission, acknowledging the facts but arguing mitigating circumstances. He intended to portray Ezekiel as a man shaped by his environment, raised in isolation, steeped in generational crime, and deprived of normal moral and social education. It was not a defense that could win an acquittal, but it might spare him from execution in favor of life imprisonment. The trial opened on a humid September morning. The courtroom was filled to capacity. Victims' families, reporters from multiple states, and curious locals all crammed in to witness history. The tension was palpable, a mix of outrage and morbid curiosity. Judge Bradford had to issue strict warnings, threatening to eject anyone who disrupted the proceedings. Harrison began with a meticulous opening statement. He laid out the timeline of events, the physical evidence, and painted Ezekiel as a deliberate and methodical predator who had preyed on innocent travelers for decades. His tone was calm and measured, relying on precise facts rather than theatrics, establishing his credibility through restraint. Over the following weeks, witness after witness took the stand. Browning gave extensive testimony, recounting his investigation step by step, from the first missing persons reports to the discovery at the property. Mallister and Chen described the unearthed remains and artifacts in detail. The physician who treated Marcus Webb testified about the injuries and trauma Webb suffered during his captivity. Then came the moment everyone anticipated. Marcus Webb himself took the stand. Still visibly fragile, he recounted in a trembling voice his nightmarish experience, how he was ambushed on the trail, brutally assaulted, and awoke chained in a pitch-black cellar, consumed by terror and starvation, waiting for death. He described overhearing faint voices debating his fate and the dreadful moment when Ezekiel descended into the cellar to question him. Probing about his background, his family, his business, Webb realized his answers would decide whether he lived or died. He lied about having close relatives and business ties, hoping to appear too noticeable to simply vanish. The defense tried to cast doubt on Webb's memory, implying that trauma could have distorted his recollection or that he exaggerated aspects of his ordeal. But Hutchinson knew pressing too hard would backfire. The jury clearly empathized with Webb. He managed only to expose a few trivial inconsistencies that didn't alter the core of his story. After Webb, the prosecution called its most pivotal witness, Jacob, the youngest member of the family and the only one who had agreed to cooperate. Nervous and pale, he avoided Ezekiel's gaze as he took the stand. Speaking in a low, trembling voice, he confirmed every major finding of the investigation and provided chilling insight into the family's internal operations. Jacob revealed that Ezekiel ruled the family with absolute authority, selecting victims, planning the ambushes, dictating how long captives were kept alive, and overseeing the disposal of bodies. The others obeyed without question, knowing defiance meant brutal punishment. Jacob described how Ezekiel would beat his own brothers for mistakes or hesitation. The most haunting part of Jacob's testimony came when he recounted his initiation into the family's crimes. At just 13, he was forced to watch the capture and killing of a traveler. He remembered vomiting afterward, sobbing through the night, only to be told by his father that weakness was a luxury they couldn't afford in the unforgiving mountains. Over the years, Jacob said, he learned to bury his conscience. Not because he stopped understanding right from wrong, but because he had to suppress those feelings to survive.